He kissed her cheek at the reception, smiled for the cameras, and whispered, "You're everything," into her ear, while his phone lit up with messages from another woman. That was the wedding night. Dominic Ravello, the most feared man in Chicago, married Amara Bennett in front of 400 witnesses, then left her alone in their bridal suite before midnight. Not because of an emergency, not because a man was dying, because his mistress wanted him there. And Amara Elegant, the kind of woman who resent her broken films, sat alone in her wedding dress while the flowers on the table slowly began to die around her. If that were you, if you had given everything to someone who was giving everything to someone else, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this hit you somewhere real, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories that go places most people are afraid to talk about. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain came down hard that night. Chicago in late October had a way of making everything feel heavier. The air, the silence, the weight of a decision you hadn't made yet, but could feel coming. Water streaked down the tall windows of the Ravello estate, like something trying to get in, and inside, 400 people laughed and drank and toasted to a love story they believed in completely. Amara Bennett, now Amara Ravello, though she hadn't yet decided how she felt about the sound of, stood near the bar and watched her husband work the room. That was the only word for it. Work. Dominic moved through crowds, the way water moves through stone, slow and inevitable, touching everyone he passed and leaving a mark. A hand on a shoulder here, a quiet word in an ear there. Men twice his age straightened when he approached. Women smiled a half-second too long. He was magnetic. She had always known that. It was one of the first things she noticed about him. It was also, she would later understand, the thing that should have frightened her. She had met Dominic 14 months earlier at a preservation gala in the Gold Coast neighborhood. Amara had been there representing her firm. She specialized in restoring historic buildings, pulling century-old structures back from the edge of demolition with careful hands and a deep, almost stubborn patience. Dominic had been there as a donor. He gave generously to the arts, to historic preservation, to civic projects. His name appeared on plaques in 3 Chicago buildings that Amara herself had helped restore. She had not known at first where the money came from. By the time she understood more fully, she was already in love with him. And Dominic had a way of making the truth feel less important than the feeling. He had pursued her with a kind of focused attention that was almost disorienting. Not aggressive Dominic was never aggressive with her, not once, not in the way some men understood aggression. He was patient, deliberate. He remembered every small thing she mentioned in passing and brought those things back to her weeks later as proof that he had been listening. He showed up to her firm's public presentations. He learned the names of historic buildings she cared about. He asked questions about her work that were specific enough to be real. Amara had been careful. She had grown up in Baltimore, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and still made time on Sunday mornings to press Amara's hair and tell her, "Baby, a man who wants to own you will spend a long time pretending he wants to know you." She had carried that warning her whole adult life. She had applied it to relationships. She had walked away from men because of it. And then she had looked at Dominic Ravello across a candlelit table 6 months into what they were calling something serious. And she had thought, this one is different. She was not stupid. She knew what he was. She had done research of her own. She had asked questions that required honesty to answer and watched his face when he answered them. There were parts of Dominic's world she did not touch, did not ask about directly, and chose not to examine too closely. She was not a woman without complexity. She understood that the building she worked in every day had been funded in the 1920s by money that nobody asked too many questions about either. She had loved him. That part was completely uncomplicatedly true. She had loved the man who stayed up until 2 in the morning, helping her sketch restoration proposals. She had loved the man who, the first time she introduced him to her mother, had sat across from that careful woman and met every quiet test with something that looked genuine. She had loved the man who, 3 months before the wedding, had held her face in both hands after a nightmare and said nothing, just stayed awake with her until she slept again. That man existed. She was sure of it. She just didn't know yet how much space the other man, the one making decisions she wasn't part of, took up in the same body. The reception was everything Dominic had promised. The estate ballroom was enormous and warm, and whatever you thought about how money was made, the man knew how to spend it in ways that felt like generosity rather than display. The flowers were real, not the waxy perfection of a catering catalog. The food was Italian and abundant, and made by a woman from Dominic's mother's hometown who flew in specifically to cook it. The band played standards from the 40s and then, around 10, shifted into something that made the older guests happy and the younger ones surprised. Amara danced with her new husband twice. The second time, she pressed her cheek against his jaw and felt him tense barely, for less than a second when his phone vibrated against his hip. She noticed. She noticed because Amara Bennett had spent her career learning to read the small structural failures that happened before something collapsed entirely. A hairline crack in plaster that most people walked past. A slight give in a floorboard that told you about water damage underneath. You learned to feel things before you could explain them. She noticed and she said nothing, and she kept dancing. He checked the phone 4 times that she counted in the next 2 hours. Each time he angled the screen away from her. Each time, when he put it back in his jacket pocket, his face reset to a version of itself that was comfortable and practiced, and just slightly delayed, the way a stage light takes half a second to reach its full brightness after someone flips the switch. At 11:15, he came to find her near the window, where she had been talking with Nico Serrano's wife, Celeste, about a property in Pilsen that Amara's firm was considering for restoration. Dominic touched her elbow. His grip was light. "Can I have a minute?" he said, and his voice had that particular quietness he used when he didn't want a conversation to have witnesses. Amara excused herself. They stood near the hallway that led toward the private rooms, away from the noise and the 100 nearby conversations. "There's a situation," Dominic said. He didn't look at her when he said it, which was not like him. Dominic almost always looked directly at whoever he was speaking to. It was one of the things his men respected about him, and one of the things that had made Amara trust him early. One of the distribution warehouses. A contract issue. "My people are dealing with it, but I need to make some calls." "Tonight," Amara said. It wasn't a question exactly. "It won't take long. An hour, maybe 2. Of course," she said. "Because what else do you say? You are 4 hours into your wedding reception. There are 400 people in the next room. You have a feeling about something you cannot name and no evidence for anything, and the man looking at you with careful apology in his eyes is your husband as of 6 hours ago. You say, of course." He kissed her forehead. He went to make his calls. Amara went back to Celeste, picked up the conversation about Pilsen, exactly where she had left it, and the feeling she had the hairline crack. The slight give in the floorboard, she pressed it down into a place where it couldn't affect her face. She was very good at that. It was closer to 1 in the morning when the reception began to thin. The older guests left first, then the business associates, then the politicians, then the friends. Dominic's captains stayed until the end, as they always stayed, because you didn't leave before the boss. Amara changed out of her wedding gown in the suite's dressing room, while the last of the guests said their goodbyes downstairs. She put on something simpler, still beautiful, still chosen for tonight, but real woman clothing rather than ceremony. She sat at the vanity and removed her earrings one at a time, and looked at her own reflection and thought, without letting the thought fully form, where is he? He came to the suite at 1:45. He looked tired in a specific way, not the tired of a long, happy night, but the tired of a man who had been carrying something heavy. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Nico got hit." He sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands, and Amara watched him, and the performance she would understand later, that it was a performance, was genuinely impressive. "I don't know yet if he's going to make it. There's a hospital, but I can't." He looked up. "I have to go." Amara stared at him. Nico Serrano. Dominic's closest man. 22 years together, through things she had never asked about directly. She had sat at Nico and Celeste's table not 3 hours ago. She had watched Nico give a toast that made half the room laugh, and two of Dominic's older captains quietly remove their glasses and look away from everyone. "Is Celeste?" "She knows," Dominic said quickly. "She's on her way to him now." He stood. He crossed to her and took her hands, and she let him, and he looked at her with something that she would later describe to herself as the most sophisticated lie she had ever witnessed in close proximity. Not because it was elaborate, because it was so specific. Because the grief in his eyes was the exact right weight, not too much, not theatrical. Just a man barely holding together in front of a woman he trusted. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry this is tonight." "Go," she said. "Go be with him." He kissed her. Left. She sat for a moment in the silence of the suite. Then she picked up her phone and called Celeste Serrano. It rang 4 times. Celeste answered from what sounded like her own living room. There was a television in the background, something low, comfortable, the sound of a house where nobody had received terrible news. "Amara? Honey, everything okay? Did something happen at the end of the night?" Amara's hand tightened on the phone. "Is Nico there?" she asked. Her voice was completely level. She had not known until that moment that she could make it completely level under these specific circumstances. A brief pause. Then, "He's right here. We just got home maybe an hour ago. He's already half asleep on the couch." "Why? What's going on?" Amara looked at the dying flowers on the table near the window. White roses, beginning to drop their petals onto the cloth beneath. "Nothing," she said. "Wrong number. Good night, Celeste." She sat with the phone in her lap for a long time after that. Not shaking, not crying, just very, very still, the way old buildings go still in the moment before you truly understand how much damage is underneath the surface. She noticed Dominic's tablet on the side table near the window. He traveled with it everywhere, used it for things he preferred not to put on his phone. She knew his passcode because she had watched him enter it 3 times, and she had a memory like a steel trap. That was not surveillance. That was just being observant. It was the same thing that made her good at her job. She typed in the 6 digits. The tablet opened to his messages, synchronized automatically from his phone. She found the thread without looking for it. It was near the top of the list. The name was Valeria. Amara read for approximately 12 minutes. 18 months of messages, photographs, promises, pet names she had never heard him use with anyone, references to trips she had not known he'd taken, to an apartment in River North he had apparently maintained for the duration of their relationship, to conversations he'd had about Amara herself, careful, strategic conversations, the kind of assessments a man makes about a resource rather than a person. The message that stopped her completely was from 9 weeks before the wedding. Dominic had written, "The marriage legitimizes everything. The board presentation, the city contracts, the senator's office. A wife like Amara is, and I mean this, tactically irreplaceable for what comes next. We stay where we are until I figure out what to do about the rest." Valeria had written back, "And when are you going to figure that out?" Dominic had not answered that question. He had changed the subject. Amara set the tablet down on the table with both hands, very carefully, as though it were a piece of crumbling 19th century plaster that would disintegrate if handled roughly. She sat for another long while. Outside Chicago was still raining. The flowers kept dropping their petals. And Amara Bennett, who had spent her entire adult career pulling broken things back from the edge of being lost forever, sat alone in the suite she was supposed to share with her husband on the first night of their marriage, and understood with the calm, terrible clarity of someone who has just seen the damage report that some things were too far gone to restore. She did not shatter anything. She did not leave a screaming voicemail. She did not pull the flowers from their vases or put her fist through anything expensive. She simply sat, and somewhere inside her quietly, without drama, the woman who had walked into that room, trusting this man completely, began the long and deliberate process of deciding exactly what came next. She didn't sleep, not even close. Amara sat in that chair beside the window until the rain outside changed character from the hard, purposeful rain of midnight to the thin, apologetic rain of early morning. The kind that doesn't know yet whether it wants to commit to being weather or just give up entirely. The flowers on the table had dropped more petals. The champagne someone had left in an ice bucket near the door was room temperature now, the ice long dissolved into a pool of cold water that had nowhere to go. She had read the messages 3 times, not because she needed to. She had understood everything completely after the first read. She read them again because she was the kind of person who needed to be certain before she moved, and moving, she already knew, was exactly what she was going to do. The only question was how. The only question was what kind of woman walked out of this room when the door finally opened. The third time through the messages, she stopped reading for comprehension and started reading for information. That was a different thing entirely. Valeria Dane. The name appeared 847 times across 18 months of messages. Amara did not count them manually. She scrolled with the methodical patience of someone cataloging structural damage, making mental notes the way she made field notes at a worksite. Valeria had a last name, which meant Valeria had an existence outside these messages, which meant Valeria was findable. The apartment Dominic referenced in River North had a building name attached to it in one early message, the Meridian, on Dearborn, which Amara knew because she had walked past it dozens of times. A legitimate luxury high-rise. The kind of building that appeared in city permit databases under its corporate ownership structure. Amara knew how to read permit databases. There were references to a company called Veldon Partners in 4 separate messages. Dominic had written, 8 months ago, the Veld arrangement works. Well, keeps everything clean on paper. Valeria had responded with a detail about a particular invoice amount. The number was specific enough to mean something. The word invoice was specific enough to mean something. Amara set the tablet face down on the table. She stood, walked to the bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists, for 30 seconds an old habit. Something her mother had taught her for moments when her brain was moving faster than her body could manage, and looked at her own face in the mirror. Her wedding makeup had held better than it deserved to. She looked, if anything, very calm. She did not trust the calm. She knew what the calm was. The calm was the structural equivalent of a building that looked fine from the street, while everything load-bearing inside was compromised. She had seen it 100 times. The most dangerous moments in restoration work were not the obvious disasters. They were the ones that looked stable until the exact second they weren't. She went back to the chair, picked up her personal phone, the one Dominic had no access to, the one she paid for herself through an account that had existed before him, and opened her contacts to a name she had not called in 8 months. Marcus Webb, attorney, family law and civil litigation. He had gone to Loyola Law with Amara's college roommate. They had met twice at professional events. She had his number because 3 years ago, before Dominic, a boyfriend situation had gotten complicated in a way that made her think briefly about her options. She had not needed Marcus then. She texted him now. 3 lines. No preamble. This is Amara Bennett. I need to speak with you urgently about a personal legal matter. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Tomorrow morning works. It is time sensitive. She put the phone face down on the table next to the tablet. Then she did something she had not done once in the hours since she'd spoken to Celeste. She let herself feel it. Not the anger was there, but it was clean and useful, and she wasn't afraid of it. She let herself feel the specific, particular grief of realizing that a version of her life she had believed in was simply not real. That the man who had held her face and stayed awake with her after the nightmare had, at that exact same period of time, been maintaining a separate life that contained another woman, and a strategic assessment of what Amara's name and presence and dignity were worth to him in a business context. She felt that for about 4 minutes. Then she folded it up and put it somewhere internal and inaccessible, the way you seal off a section of a damaged building while the rest of it remains operational. She had work to do. Dominic came back at 5:15 in the morning. She heard him before she saw him, his key card against the suite door, his footsteps, the particular weight of him moving through a space. She had turned off the overhead light an hour earlier and moved to the bed, not to sleep but to be horizontal, because she needed him to see someone who had been trying to sleep, not someone who had spent the night cataloging his messages. Came in quietly. She could tell he was trying not to wake her. She let her breathing stay slow and even. He undressed in the dark. She heard the particular sound of cufflinks on the dresser surface, his jacket over the chair, his shoes placed carefully rather than dropped. He was being considerate. He was being considerate of the wife he had left on their wedding night to go be with his mistress. And the consideration was so precisely placed that it told her everything about how long he had been doing this, managing two realities simultaneously, maintaining the texture of each so carefully that neither one collapsed. He got into bed. She kept breathing. After a few minutes, he reached over and put one hand on her back, lightly, the way you check on something you're responsible for, making sure it's still there, still yours. She did not move. He was asleep in 12 minutes. Amara lay awake and watched the ceiling slowly gather light as morning came through the curtains and thought, I know exactly what you are now. I know the shape of it. And that knowledge, terrible as it is, and it is terrible, it is the worst thing that has ever happened to me, is also the only tool I have. And I know how to use tools. She was dressed and at the window with coffee when he woke up. He blinked at her, took in the coffee, the fact that she was already dressed. The fact that she was looking out at the Chicago morning, with an expression that he apparently couldn't immediately read, because she watched him from the corner of her eye spend a full 3 seconds assessing her before he said anything. You couldn't sleep, he said. Soft. Sympathetic some, she said. How's Nico? Something moved through his face and was gone. Stable. It was bad. But they think he's going to be okay. I'm glad, she said. And she looked at him then, directly, and smiled, and it was a completely real-looking smile, because Amara had decided, in the night, that she was not going to confront him. Not now. Not here. Not before she knew everything she needed to know and had every protection she needed in place. The smile was a tool, the same as anything else. I'm glad he's going to be okay. Dominic crossed the room and kissed her. She let him. I'm sorry, he said against her hair. I know this wasn't. It's okay, she said. This is the life. I knew what I was agreeing to. He pulled back and looked at her, and she held his gaze without any difficulty, and after a moment he nodded, and something in his shoulders relaxed. And she filed that away too, the fact that his first and deepest instinct when he was uncertain about her was to look for the relaxation of tension, for evidence that nothing was wrong, and that he would accept that evidence quickly because he wanted to. That was a vulnerability. She was going to need to know all of his vulnerabilities. The week that followed was the most demanding performance of Amara Bennett's life, and she had performed in difficult circumstances before. She had negotiated with city councils who didn't want to fund preservation projects. She had presented to boards of skeptical investors in rooms where she was the youngest person and the only black woman and the only person who actually knew what she was talking about. She had kept her composure through the kind of professional condescension that required you to smile and be twice as prepared as everyone else in the room and pretend that the extra preparation was effortless. This was different. This was constant and intimate and required her to perform for an audience of one who was also watching her all the time. She made breakfast on the second morning. She had never cooked breakfast at the estate before they had staff for that. A reality she was still adjusting to, but she went to the kitchen at 7 and found what she needed and made eggs and toast and strong coffee and brought it to the small table in the sitting room of their suite. And when Dominic came out and saw it, he looked at her with something in his face that was so unguarded, she had to actively manage her own reaction to it. He looked moved. He looked like a man who had expected the morning after his wedding to be content and was instead finding something warm and uncomplicated. And the look on his face told her that some part of Dominic Ravello, some real, unperformative part, genuinely wanted this. Wanted the eggs and the coffee and the woman who made them. And that was the most painful information she had received since reading the messages, because it meant that the man she had loved was in there, somewhere, coexisting with the man who had calculated her value and decided she was useful. And that coexistence was not something she could resolve or fix or restore. It was just the truth of who he was. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. "Eat," she said, and sat across from him and picked up her own coffee and listened while he talked about his day. She listened for 7 days. It was not passive listening. Amara had always been the kind of person who heard more than people ended to say. She noticed word choices, pauses, the specific things someone redirected away from. At dinner with Dominic's captains on the 4th night, she sat beside her husband and said very little and heard a great deal. She learned that a man named Falcone, who ran a legitimate construction company under the Ravello umbrella, had been complaining recently about billing irregularities on 3 city contracts. She learned that Dominic's legitimate business interests were managed through a holding company called Ravello Capital Partners, which had a board of 7, 2 of whom were independently wealthy enough that Dominic couldn't simply instruct them. She learned that there were at least 4 men in that room who had opinions about Valeria Dane that they had clearly never expressed directly to Dominic. She learned this from the way 3 of them looked at one wall when her name came up briefly, and one of them, a quiet man named Ruiz, the oldest at the table, stared at the surface of his wine as though it had personally offended him. She filed everything. On the 5th day, Marcus Webb called her back. She took the call from the estate's east garden, a private space she had identified on the 2nd day as the one area where Dominic's men did not maintain a regular surveillance position because it was enclosed and had only one entrance that was always monitored. She was not under surveillance in any direct sense. Dominic had never treated her that way, but she was inside his world, and his world had eyes everywhere, and she was not careless about that. "Amara," Marcus said. He had a careful voice, the kind that didn't telegraph emotion before he understood the situation. "This sounds serious." "It is," she said. "I need to understand my options. Specifically regarding marital assets, separate property, and exit strategy from a marriage that is 9 days old." Pause. "Okay, I had separate assets entering the marriage. Personal savings, a professional retirement account, intellectual property connected to my firm, family heirlooms. I need to know how to establish clean documentation that none of that is subject to commingling claims." "That's manageable," Marcus said. "What else?" "The marriage involved deception at a foundational level." "Documented. I have the documentation. I need to know whether that affects the dissolution process, and whether it affects any agreements I may have signed." Another pause longer. "What kind of agreements?" "A prenuptial agreement. I had independent counsel review it before I signed it. I was advised it was standard. I'm now wondering whether the circumstances of the marriage specifically, whether material facts were concealed from me before I entered into it, affect the enforceability of any clauses within it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Amara," he said, "are you safe?" "Yes," she said. "I'm not in physical danger. I need legal protection, not personal protection." "All right. I want you to send me a copy of the agreement as soon as you can, and I want you to write down everything you know about the deception dates, specifics, documentation you have access to. Don't send it digitally from anywhere you're not certain is private. Can you access a computer outside your current residence?" "Yes," she said. "I can arrange that. Then let's set up a proper consultation. This week, if possible." She told him she would make it happen. She spent the 6th day behaving with the precise warmth and engagement of a woman settling comfortably into her new life. She accompanied Dominic to lunch with 2 city aldermen who had interests in a development project. She smiled at the right moments and said thoughtful things when addressed directly, and watched Dominic operate in public with a functionality that was almost clinical, the way she might at a building, and assess what was holding it up and what wasn't. She used the estate's business center that afternoon, while Dominic was in meetings, to log into a legal document platform she had created an account with from her personal phone the day before. She uploaded the prenuptial agreement. She uploaded photographs of the relevant tablet messages, taken in the night with her phone while the screen's brightness was low. She sent everything to Marcus through an encrypted transfer he had specified. Then she cleared the browser history, logged out, and went to find her husband for dinner. At dinner, Dominic raised his wine glass. He looked at her, across the candlelight, with an expression that she recognized now, that specific warmth he had shown her from the beginning, the attention that felt real, because some part of it was real, even now, even given everything. He said, "You were made for this life." Amara held his gaze. She thought about 18 months of messages. She thought about a name and a thread. She thought about a specific sentence, "The marriage legitimizes everything." And she thought about the word "tactically." And she thought about apartment. And she thought about the apartment on Dearborn, and a company called Veldon Partners, and an invoice number she had memorized. She smiled. "I'm starting to think so," she said. He looked pleased. That night, in the dark, while Dominic slept with his hand on her back again, still checking, still confirming she was there, Amara stared at the ceiling and made a decision. She was leaving. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. She needed 3 more days' time for Marcus to review everything and give her the framework. Time to confirm the status of her separate assets. Time to identify one more specific piece of information she needed about Veldon Partners and the financial arrangement with Valeria. 3 more days of eggs at the morning table and smiling at captains and being kissed on the forehead, while the man kissing her believed absolutely that she was exactly where he had placed her. 3 days. On the 7th morning, Dominic told her at breakfast that he had to leave the city. How long, she asked. Through the weekend, maybe into Monday. He was watching his phone as he said it, a habit she had cataloged. This reaching for the phone in moments when he was slightly distracted by something else, by something he was managing that had nothing to do with what he was saying out loud. What's happening? Nothing urgent. A meeting in Detroit. Some business with the transport contracts. He put the phone face down. You'll be fine here. Anything you need, you tell Marco. Marco, the house manager, the one who also happened to know which cars were available and which phone lines were monitored. She had cataloged Marco too. Of course, she said. I might work from here this weekend. I have a proposal I've been wanting to get back to. Good. He looked up at her, the genuine warmth again, the look that made things complicated. I want you to feel like this is home, actually. She held that for a second. I'm getting there, she said. He left at 10:30. The armored convoy, 3 black SUVs, his standard configuration for out-of-city travel, cleared the estate gates, and Amara stood at the window of their suite and watched until the last vehicle turned onto the main road and was gone. She stood there for about 60 seconds. Then she moved. Not quickly. Quickly was for people who were panicking, and she was not panicking. She moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had made a detailed plan and was now executing it without revision. She went to the closet and pulled out the travel bag she had identified on day 3, not a Ravello-purchased piece of luggage, but a plain canvas duffel she had brought with her from her own apartment before the wedding. She packed in order of importance. Documents first. Her original passport, birth certificate, professional licenses. A folder of personal financial records she had quietly printed from the estate's business and hidden inside an architectural reference book on her work shelf, a shelf Dominic's men would not disturb because nobody was. Interested in 19th century masonry techniques. Family photographs. Her mother's pearl earrings. A small oil painting no bigger than a hardback book that had hung in her mother's kitchen for 30 years. Personal savings cards and the documentation for her retirement account. Clothes a week's worth. Practical. The kinds of clothes she had owned before any of this. She left everything Dominic had bought her. Every piece of jewelry. And there was significant jewelry. He had given her things that could have funded a small building restoration. Every designer outfit. The closet that had been built out with an entire new wardrobe was simply left intact. Every accessory, every gift, every beautiful, expensive thing she had been given as part of the performance of being Mrs. Ravello. She zipped the canvas duffel. She went to Dominic's study, a room she had been in, perhaps a dozen times, invited each time, never alone. She had memorized its layout. She went to his desk. She placed the tablet there, open to the message thread with Valeria. She positioned it so the first thing visible was the message about the marriage, legitimizing everything. She placed her wedding ring beside the tablet. It was a simple ring, by Dominic's standards. It asked her what she wanted. And she had said something real, not performative, and he had gotten her a solitaire in a plain band that was quieter than anything else he owned. She had loved it, initially. She set it down. Then she took a card from her bag, plain white, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, and wrote on it in her own handwriting, careful and clear, "I know everything." She propped it against the tablet. She picked up her duffel. She left the study door exactly as she had found it. In the main hall, she encountered Marco. He looked at the bag. He looked at her face. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, exactly, more like the recognition of something he had suspected was coming without knowing when. "Mrs. Ravello," he said carefully. "Marco," she said. "I'd like a car, please. To the train station." A pause. "Mr. Ravello didn't mention." "Mr. Ravello isn't here," she said pleasantly. "I'd like a car." Marco looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at the bag again. Then he looked back at her face, and whatever he saw there made the calculation for him, and he said, "I'll have one ready in 5 minutes." "Thank you," she said. She waited near the front entrance. She did not sit. She stood with the duffel at her feet and looked at the estate's front hall, the marble, the art, the height of the ceilings, the kind of space designed to communicate power to everyone who entered it, and she felt nothing about leaving it. That was useful to know, that she felt nothing about the marble and the art. Car came. She got in. She did not look back at the estate as the car pulled out through the gates. She looked forward at the Chicago street ahead of her, at the morning traffic, and the ordinary people moving through it. And somewhere between the estate and the train station, she felt the first thing that was entirely her own since the night of the wedding. Not relief. Not yet, but the beginning of it. The very first edge of something that might eventually become relief, distant and tentative, the way you sometimes see the structural integrity of a salvageable building through all the damage, not fixed, not close to fixed, but genuinely still there, underneath everything that had been done to it. She was going to be fine. She didn't know yet exactly how or when or what fine would look like. But she was going to be fine. The car reached the station. She thanked the driver, got out, carried her own bag through the entrance, and disappeared into the crowd of people who did not know her name. In the study of the Ravello estate, on a desk in a quiet room, a tablet screen glowed with 18 months of messages, and a wedding ring sat beside a white card with 3 words on it, waiting for the moment when the most feared man in Chicago walked through the door and found that the woman he had chosen to use was already gone, and that she had taken nothing of his with her, which would turn out to be the most devastating part of all. Dominic Ravello returned to the estate at 6:47 in the evening. Not Monday, not Sunday. Friday evening, because the Detroit meeting had concluded 4 hours early, a fact nobody had called ahead to announce, because nobody had expected it to matter. The convoy pulled through the gates, and the gravel crunched under the tires the way it always did, and the house looked exactly the way it always looked at this hour, lit from inside, quiet at the perimeter, his men in their positions. Everything exactly right. He came through the front entrance and handed his coat to the staff without looking up, and was already moving toward the kitchen he hadn't eaten since noon, and he was thinking about that specifically, about food, about a drink, about finding Amara and telling her the Detroit thing resolved faster than expected, and maybe they could do something tomorrow that wasn't about business when Marco appeared at the far end of the hall. Marco's face stopped him. Not what Marco said. He hadn't said anything yet. Just his face, which was carrying an expression that Dominic had not seen on that particular man in 11 years of working together, which was the expression of someone who has information they would genuinely prefer not to deliver. Dominic went still. "Where is she?" he said. Not a question. Dominic didn't phrase things as questions when he already knew the shape of the answer. Marco said, "She left this morning, shortly after you did. She asked for a car to the train station." A pause. "I didn't feel I could refuse her." Dominic looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't feel you could refuse her?" "She's your wife," Marco said carefully. "She asked for a car. She was calm. She had a bag." Another pause, shorter. "I didn't know if I didn't know what the right call was." Dominic walked past him. He went straight to the study because something in the base of his skull was telling him to go to the study. Some instinct that had kept him alive in situations that required good instincts. And he pushed the door open and stood in the entrance and saw the desk. He stood there for a long time, long enough that Marco, who had followed him to the doorway and stopped there, shifted his weight once and then went completely still again. The tablet, the ring, the card. Dominic crossed the room in 4 steps and looked at the tablet screen without picking it up. He read what was visible. He knew what thread it was immediately, the particular timestamp format, the name at the top, and his jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with anger yet and everything to do with the specific cognitive experience of a man who has just realized that his most careful compartment has been opened by someone he never considered a threat. He picked up the ring. It was small in his palm. He had chosen it himself. She had told him what she wanted, something real, not performative. Those were her exact words, and he had spent 2 weeks looking before he found the right thing. He remembered being certain about it. He remembered showing it to Nico, and Nico saying nothing for a moment and then, "Yeah, that's right." He closed his fist around it. "Get Nico," he said. "He's get him here." Now Marco left. Dominic stood in the study and read his own messages on the tablet screen and felt something he did not have a clean word for. Not guilt exactly. Not yet, because guilt required a kind of stillness he wasn't capable of in this moment. What he felt was closer to the sensation of watching something fall and being unable to calculate fast enough where it was going to land. He called Amara's phone. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was professional and warm. The voice she used for clients and for people she didn't know well, and hearing that voice, that particular register of careful, managed distance in response to his call, told him something he needed to know about where he stood. Called again. Same result. He put the phone on the desk and looked at the card. 3 words. Her handwriting, he knew her handwriting, had seen it on architectural notes and grocery lists and a letter she had written him early in their relationship that he had kept in his desk at his downtown office, in the top right drawer behind his personal calendar. Her handwriting was clean and deliberate, the kind that reflected a person who had been taught to slow down and form each letter correctly, who had internalized that patience as a value rather than just a technique. "I know everything." He sat down in his desk chair. For the first time in a very long time, Dominic Ravello did not know what move to make next. Nico arrived 40 minutes later. He came in without knocking. He was the only person in Dominic's world who did that, and took in the study with a single sweep of his eyes, the tablet, the ring on the desk where Dominic had set it. Dominic himself, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, which was a posture Nico had seen exactly twice in 2 decades. "She's gone," Dominic said. "I can see that." She read the messages. He gestured at the tablet. "I don't know how long she had access. At least since the wedding night." Nico looked at the tablet. He didn't move to read it. He looked back at Dominic. "How much does she know?" "Everything in there." "Which is—" Dominic stopped, pressed his mouth together. "It's enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to know what the marriage was for." "In my words." He said it flatly, with no attempt to soften it, because he and Nico had operated for 20 years on the understanding that softening things between them was a waste of time. "I told Valeria the marriage was tactical. I said Amara was irreplaceable for what comes next." "Those are my words, Nico." She read them on our wedding night. Nico was quiet. "She didn't say anything," Dominic continued. "For 7 days, she said nothing. She sat at dinner with my captains, and she smiled, and she made breakfast, and she kissed me goodbye when I left this morning, and said she was going to work on a proposal this weekend." He looked up. 7 days. Nico sat down in the chair across the desk. "Dominic," he said. "Don't. I'm going to say it." "I said don't. You did this," Nico said. His voice was even. Not cruel. Nico had never been cruel in the way some men in their world understood cruelty, which was why he had survived in it for so long. "You did this on your wedding night, and she found out, and she handled it better than you deserved, and now she's gone." That's the whole story. Dominic's hands tightened against each other. "I need to find her," he said. "Why?" "What do you mean, why?" "What are you going to do when you find her?" Nico leaned forward. What exactly is the plan? You're going to bring her back here? You're going to explain? You're going to what? Dominic. What's the move? I don't know yet. That's honest, at least. I need to know she's safe, Dominic said, and he said it with a rawness that clearly surprised even himself, because he stopped afterward and looked slightly away, as though the statement had come out of somewhere he hadn't authorized. Nico studied him. She's not in danger, he said carefully. She's not a target. She has nothing that threatens anyone. She's a woman who walked out of a bad situation. She's my wife. She's a woman who found out what you actually think of her and left, Nico said. There's a difference. Dominic stood up from the chair abruptly, which was not something he did. Dominic moved with control, with deliberateness. The sudden movement was a tell, and they both knew it. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room. I need her location, he said. Talk to our people. Someone drove her to the station. I want to know which train. I'm not doing that, Nico said. The room went very quiet. Dominic turned around slowly. In the 18 years since Nico had come to work for him, Nico had refused a direct request 3 times. Dominic remembered each occasion precisely because they were so rare. Each time Nico had been right. Excuse me, Dominic said. She isn't your property. Nico's voice was steady. I'll do a lot of things for you. I'll do things I'm not proud of. You know that, but I'm not tracking your wife down because she left you for a reason you know is legitimate. That I'm not doing. Dominic stared at him. You betrayed her on your wedding night, Nico said. You left her alone and you went to another woman, and she sat in that room and found out everything, and then she came down to breakfast and made you eggs. And you had no idea, because you looked at her and you saw someone who was manageable. He paused. That's not something I can fix for you. The silence in the room lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. Then Dominic said very quietly, "Get out." Nico stood. He walked to the door. He paused in the doorway, not Marco's tentative pause, but Nico's particular pause, the one that meant he had something final to say and was deciding whether to say it. He said it. You should let her go. Whatever you're feeling right now, you should let her go, and you should sit with what you did, and figure out if there's a version of you that deserves to feel bad about it. He didn't wait for a response. I'll be at the house if you need me. He left. Dominic stood alone in the study for a long time. Then, he had picked up his phone and did something that was either the most controlled decision he had made all evening or the least controlled, depending on how you looked at it. He called Valeria. She answered on the second ring. I need to see you, he said. Dominic, tonight. A pause. Her breathing on the line was careful, the way her breathing always was when she was deciding something. Where? The Meridian. An hour he hung up. He picked up the wedding ring from the desk and stood with it in his hand for a moment, and then he put it in his jacket pocket, and he walked out of the study and through the estate and into the waiting car. Valeria Dane opened the apartment door in a silk robe, which told Dominic that she had been home all evening. She changed into the robe when she was home for the night. He had observed this pattern over 18 months. Her hair was loose, there was a glass of white wine on the kitchen counter, and the television was on low. She had the particular composed ease of a woman who was very good at making spaces feel like she had always belonged in them. She read his face in about 2 seconds. She left, Valeria said. When did you talk to her? Dominic said. He was inside the apartment now, door closed behind him. Valeria didn't move from where she was standing, near the kitchen counter, her hand resting near the wine glass in a way that might have looked relaxed to someone who didn't know her. I haven't talked to her. She had access to my tablet. Dominic, she read every message. 7 days ago, at minimum. He watched her face. Did you know? How would I know? Valeria. His voice dropped to a register she had heard before, not often, and when she heard it, she generally understood that the conversation had changed character. Did you know she had access? No. Her chin lifted slightly. I did not know your wife was reading your messages. If I had known that, I would have told you. He held her gaze. She held his. There was a history in this room, 18 months of it, spread across the South Suburban and 2 others, and a dozen trips, and the particular intimacy of people who have told each other things they don't tell other people. Dominic knew Valeria's intelligence well. He knew she was careful. He knew she thought in long sequences, planned ahead, built contingencies. He had valued those qualities in her because they mirrored his own. He was now reconsidering what those qualities meant for his exposure. "I want to ask you something directly," he said. "Go ahead." The Veld arrangement. He watched her. "Walk me through it." Something happened in her eyes. Not obvious. Valeria was not an obvious woman. But he had spent 18 months learning the specific register of her micro-expressions, and what moved across her face in that half-second was not nothing. "What about it?" she said. "The billing structure, the specific invoices, the companies on the receiving end." Took a step toward her, not threatening. He had never been physically threatening with Valeria. That was not how they operated, but closing distance in the particular way. That meant he wanted there to be nowhere for the conversation to go, except toward the truth. "Explain it to me like I've never seen the numbers." "It's a standard, Valeria." She stopped. The silence in the room was different from the silence in the study. That silence had been about him sitting with his own damage. This silence was about two people who had trusted each other with specific things, recognizing simultaneously that the trust had a shape, and that shape had edges, and one of them had possibly moved past those edges without permission. "The Veld arrangement is legitimate," she said. "The billing structure reflects market rates for the consulting services. The consulting services billed by 3 companies I have just been told are connected to a man named Caruso's who is connected to your family." His voice was very level. The leveler he got, the more dangerous it was, and she knew that. "A fact that is not in any disclosure I signed." Her expression didn't change. That was when Dominic understood. Not suspected. Not calculated. Understood. "How long?" he said. "Dominic, how long have you been doing this?" She set the wine glass down. The small click of it on the counter was the only sound in the room. "You want to talk about what's legitimate?" she said, and her voice had shifted. Now the composed ease was still there, but underneath it was something harder, the bedrock of a woman who had spent 18 months waiting for this exact conversation and had decided, at some point, that she was not going to lose it. "You've been maintaining me in this apartment for 18 months. You've been telling me that you're handling it, that you're figuring out the rest. And then you married her." Her eyes were steady. "You married a woman you described to me as a tactical asset. In writing. And you expected me to wait. That doesn't. I built something for myself," she said, "while I was waiting for you to make a decision you were never going to make. The Veld arrangement is profitable, and it is mostly legal. And if you want to go through every invoice with your accountants, then you go ahead, because I have been very careful." "Mostly," Dominic repeated. She didn't answer that. "Mostly legal," he said. "In companies that carry my name." He was completely still now, the way the estate had looked completely fine from the outside, when he came home to find it empty. "Tell me where the exposure is." "There isn't." "Tell me where the exposure is, Valeria." She looked at him for a long moment. The composure was doing real work now, holding together under something that wanted to come apart. Could see it working. "The Q3 invoices from last year," she said finally. "The Meridian contract specifically. The markup is it's higher than standard. Significantly." "How significantly?" 40% above market on 3 contracts. Three. And the differential went through an account in the Veld structure. Yes. Caruso. A pause. "And to a separate account. That is mine." The room was very quiet for a long time. Dominic turned and walked to the window. Chicago at night, the lake barely visible in the distance, the lights going on forever in every direction. His city in every way that mattered, and some ways that didn't. He had built things in this city for 20 years. He had also destroyed things in this city for 20 years. He understood that both were true, and that the balance between them was what you actually were, when you got down to it. When you took away the marble and the armored cars, and the men who straightened when you walked in. "You were taking my money," he said. Quiet, almost conversational. "While I was maintaining this apartment. While I was here. You were taking money from my legitimate companies through a structure I didn't know was compromised. A fraction of what you... That's not the point," he said. He turned back around. "The point is, you had access, and you used it specifically through a channel that connects to people I don't control." He paused. which means my exposure doesn't stop at the invoice. She didn't answer. How many people know about Caruso's involvement? Her jaw tightened. A limited number. Give me a number. 4. Maybe 5. Maybe 5, Dominic repeated. He stood there and looked at the woman he had spent 18 months with, who was intelligent and careful, and who had apparently been running a secondary calculation the entire time, not unlike. He was now forced to acknowledge with a particular bitterness his own secondary calculation about Amara. The symmetry of it was not lost on him. He was not a man who missed symmetry. He had used Amara without her knowledge. Valeria had used him without his. He did not experience this as equivalence. He experienced it as information. You're going to give me everything, he said. Every account number, every invoice, every document that exists related to the Veld arrangement. Tonight. And then you're going to tell me exactly what Caruso knows and what leverage, if any, he believes he has. Valeria looked at him carefully. And then what? And then I'm going to spend the next several weeks cleaning up a situation that should never have existed. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd laid it. And you are going to step back from every Ravello company you currently have a role in. Effective immediately. Dominic, this isn't a negotiation, he said. You built yourself a position inside something that carries my name and my exposure, and you did it while telling me you were waiting on a future I was not actually planning to give you. So no, this is not a negotiation. You give me everything I need to contain the damage, and you walk away from every piece of this that isn't yours. She stared at him. He waited. Fine, she said. The word was controlled and cold, and had a quality of finality to it that told him she had also been running a calculation about this outcome, and had arrived at her conclusion before he had finished speaking. That bothered him more than the invoices. He stayed for 3 hours. She gave him documents from a folder she kept not digitally, physically, a manila folder in the back of a closet behind a stack of fashion books, which told him she had prepared for exactly this possibility with exactly this level of planning. He photographed every page. He wrote down the account information and the contact details for Caruso's associate and the name of the attorney who had structured the Veld entities. At 11:45, he stood at the apartment door. She was sitting on the couch, with her arms crossed, the wine glass untouched, watching him with an expression he could not fully read, and wasn't sure he wanted to. Was any of it real, she said? He held the door handle. Yes, he said, because it was true. Some of it had been real. That was the worst part of every answer he was giving tonight. Not enough of it. He left. In the elevator going down, he put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the wedding ring, small and cold against his fingers, and stood there in the moving elevator, thinking about Amara, sitting alone in a bridal suite while he was in this building. And he thought about 7 days of breakfasts and dinners and kisses, and the word, of course, delivered with a smile that had apparently concealed the entirety of her knowledge and the entirety of her plan. She had not stolen anything. She had not threatened anyone. She had not used a single piece of his criminal world against him. She had simply picked up her own things and left his ring, and left 3 words that were true. The elevator reached the lobby. He walked out into the cold Chicago night and got into his car, and his driver looked at him in the rearview mirror and said nothing, because that was what good drivers understood was required. Home, Dominic said. The car pulled into traffic. Dominic sat in the back and looked at the city moving past the windows and understood, with the clarity that only arrives when everything you thought you controlled has demonstrated it was never controlled at all, that the problem was not Valeria's invoices. The invoices were a problem. The exposure through Caruso was a serious problem. These were problems he could fix, given time and resources, and the particular skill set he had spent 20 years developing. Problem that he could not fix, that did not respond to resources or skill sets, or the kind of patient, deliberate pressure he had applied to every difficult situation of his adult life, was the problem of what he had done to a woman who had done nothing to deserve it, who had loved him with the kind of careful, hard-won trust that took years to build, and that he had taken and weighed against his ambition and found useful. That problem did not have a solution he knew how to find. And Dominic Ravello sitting in the back of his car in the city he had spent his life mastering, was beginning to understand for the first time, and far too late, that some problems existed specifically because you had convinced yourself they were not problems at all, and that by the time they proved otherwise, the person you had most wronged was already too far gone to reach the end of the sentence before the door opened, and everything changed again. The car hit a pothole on Michigan Avenue, and Dominic's hand closed around the ring in his pocket, and he pressed it into his palm until the edge of the band left a mark in his skin, and he stared out the window at the city that had made him, and wondered for the first time in his adult life whether the thing that made you powerful and the thing that made you worth anything were the same thing, or whether they had always been two entirely separate categories that he had simply never bothered to distinguish between. They were not the same thing. He understood that now. Understanding did not help him. The car pulled through the estate gates, and the gravel crunched, and the house stood exactly where it always stood, lit from inside, entirely unchanged, utterly indifferent to the fact that everything inside it had shifted on its foundation in ways that no external examination would reveal. Dominic got out of the car. He went inside. He went directly to the study and sat at his desk in the dark for a long time, the tablet and the ring and the card all exactly where he had left them. And the city went quiet around him, the way cities go quiet at 2 a.m, when even the things that never sleep get tired. And he sat there and did not sleep and did not move, and held in one hand the documentation of Valeria's financial betrayal, and in his jacket pocket the wedding ring of the woman he had betrayed first. And the weight of both was approximately equal, and he did not know what to do with that equation. He stayed at the desk until 4. Then he picked up his phone and called his head of financial compliance. "I need a full audit," he said when the man answered, groggy and alarmed. "Veld and Partners and every entity connected to it. I need names, amounts, the contract structure on the Meridian billing, and I need to know every point of external contact. Start tonight." Tonight, Dominic said. "I'll expect a preliminary report by Monday morning. If you need more people, hire more people. This takes precedence over everything." He hung up. Then he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about Amara on a train going somewhere he didn't know, with a canvas bag that contained only things that had been hers before him. And he thought about the fact that she had left every diamond and every designer piece and every expensive gift, and he understood what that meant, not as a statement directed at him, not as theater, but as something she had done for herself, to leave with the precise same weight she had arrived with, to walk out of his world without carrying any of it on her body. She had restored herself the way she restored buildings, stripped back to original materials. He did not sleep that night. By 6 a.m, he had emails from his compliance team with preliminary findings that were worse than Valeria had indicated. The Meridian billing markup was 40% on 3 contracts and 32% on 2 additional contracts she had not mentioned. The Veld entities connected not only to Caruso but to a second external party, a commercial real estate broker named Dantini, who had facilitated 3 separate lease agreements for Ravello Capital Partners, properties in the past 18 months, each at above market rates, each with a referral fee structure that routed money through an account Dominic's name was nowhere near, but whose beneficial ownership, when traced through 2 shell layers, landed in a place that would take a forensic accountant approximately 4 hours to connect back to the Veld arrangement. 4 hours. That was how much buffer he had between his legitimate business reputation and a financial scheme he had not known existed inside his own organization. He called his attorney at 6:15. He called Nico at 6:40. Nico arrived at the estate at 7:30 and sat across the desk and read the preliminary report without expression, which was Nico's version of maximum alarm. "How bad?" Dominic said. "Bad enough that you need to move fast." Nico set the papers down. "The Dantini connection is the problem. If anyone with an interest in examining your legitimate operations starts pulling that thread, Myson." "I know. The referral fee structure is documented." "I know, Nico. And Valeria is the only person who can explain the origin of the arrangement in a way that separates you from it." Dominic looked at him, which means, Nico said carefully, that Valeria is either an asset or a liability, depending on what she decides to do next. And she is not currently a person who has a strong reason to do you favors. The room was quiet. She'll do what protects herself, Dominic said. That's what she does, which means she separates herself from the exposure and points toward Caruso and lets the Veld structure take the consequences. Does that work for you? If she does it correctly, yes. If she gets creative, no. He stood. I'm meeting with the attorneys this morning. Full disclosure, full cooperation on the cleanup. I want the Veld entities dissolved and the Dontini relationship terminated by end of business Monday. That's aggressive. It has to be aggressive. Every day that structure exists is another day it's findable. He picked up his jacket. And I want security on Valeria's building, not to confine her, to know if anyone approaches her. Nico nodded slowly. You think Caruso is going to want to talk to her? Caruso is going to realize very shortly that the arrangement he had is about to disappear. That makes him a man with a grievance and no legal protection, and a tendency, based on what I've read about him, toward direct communication. Dominic buttoned his jacket. I want to know before he gets there. He was at his attorney's offices by 9. The meeting lasted 4 hours. 2 senior partners, his personal counsel, and a forensic accountant had worked with the firm for 12 years, who looked at the preliminary Veld documentation with the expression of someone counting a bill that is higher than expected, but not, mercifully, high enough to be unsurvivable. The exposure is real but contained, the accountant said. If you move fast and document the separation cleanly. I'm moving fast, Dominic said. The question is Caruso. If he decides he has leverage. He doesn't have leverage, Dominic said. He has a fee structure and a connection to an entity that is being dissolved. His leverage requires Valeria's cooperation, and Valeria is going to be advised by counsel I am providing that her best outcome is a clean separation and a very detailed memory regarding Caruso's role in originating the arrangement. One of the senior partners looked at him over her glasses. You're providing Valeria's counsel? Her independent counsel, Dominic said. I'm paying for it. That's the extent of it. She decides what to say. I have no control over that. A pause. I'm choosing to believe she'll make the obvious decision. And if she doesn't? Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then we deal with what she decides. He left the attorney's offices at 1 in the afternoon and sat in the car and called Valeria. She answered this time. I'm sending you a name, he said. An attorney, completely independent from anything connected to me. You need to call him today. Dominic, I'm cleaning up the Veld situation. All of it. The entities are being dissolved, and Dontini is being terminated. Caruso is going to find out soon, and when he does, he's going to come to you. He paused. The attorney will help you manage that. Silence on the line. Then, you're protecting me. I'm protecting the situation. That's not the same thing. No, he said, it isn't. Another pause. Call the attorney, Valeria. He hung up. That evening, the preliminary audit expanded. The compliance team found 2 more billing irregularities in a different business unit, not connected to Veld. Connected to a supplier relationship that had been managed by a mid-level operations director who had apparently taken a page from Valeria's approach and applied it to a much smaller scale. The director's name was Ferretti. He was 29. He had been with Ravello Capital Partners for 3 years. Dominic read the findings in his study and felt a particular exhaustion that was different from the exhaustion of not sleeping. It was the exhaustion of understanding that the rot was not located in one place. That the specific vulnerability he had created by mixing his personal arrogance with his professional structure had sent a signal through his organization. The signal that the top of the hierarchy was distracted and the standards were soft and the oversight was not what it appeared to be. He had created that signal himself. He called the operations director's supervisor. Ferretti is terminated, he said. Tonight, I want documentation of everything he touched, flagged for review by end of week. Pause. Understood. And I want a full review of every supplier relationship managed at that level. All of them. He stopped. This doesn't happen again. Yes, sir. He hung up and sat in the quiet study and thought about the hairline crack in the plaster Amara's phrase The thing she had told him once about restoration work, about how the visible damage was almost never the whole damage, about how you could never fix what you could not see, and you could not see it until you were willing to look every inch of the structure instead of just the parts that looked concerning. She had been talking about buildings. He was sitting in the wreckage of everything she had described. 2 days passed. On Sunday afternoon, Nico called. Caruso reached out, he said. Dominic set down his coffee. To Valeria? To one of our people. A low-level contact in the transport operation. He left a message. A pause. The message was that he wants to speak with you directly. About the Veld arrangement. About his money, Nico said. Specifically, about the fact that the entity through which he was receiving it is apparently being dissolved without his advance knowledge or consent. Dominic was quiet. He used the word consent, Nico said. Thought that was worth mentioning. Where is he? He's in the city. He's been here for 3 days. Which means he knew something was happening before you made your move. That was important. That meant Valeria had communicated with Caruso before giving Dominic the documents. That meant the sequence of events was slightly different from the sequence he had assumed, and in situations where the sequence mattered, slightly different was the same as entirely different. Set up the meeting, Dominic said. Are you sure? Set it up. Neutral location. A restaurant somewhere public and documented. Tomorrow. Public, Nico repeated. Caruso wants to discuss a business arrangement in the context of a dissolving entity. Public restaurant is exactly where that conversation happens. It's unremarkable, it's documented by its own nature, and it does not give him anything he can use later. Dominic picked up his coffee again. Set it up. The restaurant was a place on the near north side, Italian, traditional, the kind of room where the noise level was high enough that nearby tables couldn't follow a conversation, but not so high that you had to raise your voice to be heard at your own. Dominic arrived first, which was always intentional. You controlled more of a conversation when you were already seated when the other person walked in. Caruso was 53, shorter than Dominic had expected from the file. With the particular build of a man who had once been physically powerful and had allowed it to settle into something softer without entirely losing the memory of what it had been. He wore a suit that was good but not exceptional, and he sat down across from Dominic without offering his hand. Thank you for meeting me, Caruso said. His voice was careful, accented slightly northern Italian, the kind that came from childhood rather than from effort. Of course, Dominic said. The waiter came. Dominic ordered water. Caruso ordered the same, which told Dominic he was also treating this as a business conversation rather than a social one. The Veld arrangement, Caruso said, once the waiter was gone, is being dissolved, Dominic said. Effective Monday. I'm aware. Caruso's jaw tightened slightly. What I'm not aware of is whether the obligations under that arrangement are being honored during the dissolution or whether the dissolution is itself intended as a way to avoid those obligations. Define obligations, Dominic said. There are 3 outstanding invoices, Caruso said. From the Q4 cycle, they have not been paid. The total is significant. Invoices for what services? Caruso looked at him. The look had an edge to it, not threatening exactly. More the look of a man who was deciding whether to answer a question that seemed to him either genuinely ignorant or strategically stupid, and was leaning toward strategically stupid. The consulting arrangement, Caruso said, through the Veld structure, which was established by a party who was not authorized to commit Ravello capital partner to external financial obligations, Dominic said. His voice was level and factual, exactly like a man stating terms in a negotiation that he has already decided the outcome of. Which means the invoices you're referring to are not obligations of this organization. They're claims against an entity that no longer exists. Caruso was quiet for a moment. That's a very clean position, he said. It's an accurate position. It's also a position that doesn't account for my understanding of the arrangement, which was that Ravello Capital Partners was the ultimate principle. Then your understanding was incorrect, Dominic said. And whoever gave you that understanding was not in a position to do so. The table was quiet. At the table next to them, two men were talking about a Cubs game with an intensity that suggested they had money on it. "I want to be direct with you," Caruso said. "Please. I have documentation of the arrangement, correspondence, the financial trail." He paused. "It connects to people I think you'd prefer it not connect to." Dominic looked at him steadily. "That documentation describes a financial arrangement with Veld and Partners," Dominic said, "which is a dissolved entity with no connection to any current Ravello business structure. What that documentation does not contain, and I want to be precise here, is my signature, my authorization, my name in any capacity, or any communication originating from me." He paused. "Is that correct?" Caruso's jaw worked slightly. "You're a former employee who acted outside her authority and has been separated from the organization," Dominic said. "This is documented. The separation is dated. The scope of her unauthorized activities is documented. My attorneys have been thorough. The word dated landed exactly as Dominic intended it to land." Caruso understood what dating meant. It meant the documentation had been created before this conversation, which meant it was a fact rather than a response to this conversation, which meant the position Dominic was stating was not improvised. It was constructed. It had been constructed carefully, and it was going to hold. "So you're telling me," Caruso said very quietly, "that I have 3 unpaid invoices and no one to collect from?" "I'm telling you," Dominic said, "that the arrangement you believe you had did not legally exist in the form you believed it to exist, and that the correct party to address your claims to is the former employee who represented otherwise, whose counsel will be in contact with you this week." "Valeria," Caruso said. "Her counsel," Dominic said. Caruso picked up his water glass and set it back down without drinking from it, and looked at Dominic with an expression that was moving through several stages: calculation, anger, the arithmetic of a man deciding whether the cost of escalation was worth what he stood to recover, and Dominic watched the calculation happen without moving. "You're very composed," Caruso said finally. "I'm having a direct conversation," Dominic said. "You're also sitting here without backup," Caruso said, "which is interesting." Dominic let the statement sit there for a moment. Then he said, "I'm having lunch." He reached for his own water glass. "If you want to eat, I'd recommend the risotto. The chef here is from Bergamo. It's worth the trip." Caruso stared at him. The two men were not going to fight in this restaurant. They both knew that. The question had been whether Caruso arrived as someone with leverage or someone with a grievance and no collection mechanism, and the answer to that question had been determined before he sat down. What remained was for Caruso to finish the process of understanding his position and arrive at the obvious conclusion, which Dominic was content to wait for. "The invoices," Caruso said one more time. "Her counsel," Dominic said one more time. Caruso stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, put it on with 2 precise movements, and looked down at Dominic for a moment. "You should know," he said, "that Valeria called me 4 days ago." Dominic held his face perfectly still. "She told me you were going to do exactly this," Caruso said. "She told me to get documentation of my own together, before your attorneys made their move." He paused. "She told me she'd told you everything, and that you'd come to her, and that you'd want her help cleaning it up. She told me to expect this call with you." Another pause, and now something moved across his face that was close to reluctant respect. "She was right about all of it, which makes me think she's smarter than either of us gave her credit for." He left. Dominic sat at the table alone, and drank his water and looked at the middle distance past the restaurant's front window at the street outside, and understood in full the complete geometry of what had happened. Valeria had known. She had known from the moment he showed up at the Meridian with his jaw set and his jacket on that he was going to want a clean separation, and he was going to want her cooperation to get it. She had given him the documents. She had taken his attorney referral. She had done all of it knowing that she had already called Caruso and told him to prepare, which meant she had created a situation where both things were true simultaneously. She was cooperating with Dominic's cleanup, and she had warned his adversary that the cleanup was coming. Both things, at the same time, which meant her cooperation protected her. And Caruso's warning protected her. She had insulated herself from every direction, simultaneously, which meant if Dominic moved against her in any way, she had a man with documentation and a grievance who knew exactly who to talk to. She wasn't protecting Caruso. She was protecting herself. She had been protecting herself. Dominic understood now, for 18 months. The entire time. The Veld arrangement wasn't greed, or it wasn't only greed. It was an exit strategy. It was money put somewhere. He couldn't reach it, against the day when being Dominic Ravello's hidden priority became less sustainable than whatever came after. She had watched him move toward marrying Amara, and she had understood what that meant, and she had made her own plan. Dominic sat in the restaurant for another 20 minutes. Then he paid the check he always paid, wherever he was, whoever he was with, and he walked outside into the cold afternoon and stood on the sidewalk and called Nico. "Caruso's not the problem," he said when Nico answered. "What happened?" "Valeria called him 4 days ago. She warned him." He started walking toward the car. "She's not acting against me. She's just covered. She put herself in a position where I can't move against her without it costing me more than it costs her." Pause. "That's smart," Dominic said. "It's smart." He reached the car. The driver opened the door. "She and I are done. The Veld cleanup proceeds. Caruso's going to make noise, but he's got no collection mechanism, and he knows it. He got in. But I need you to know that she made that move before she gave me the documents. Before she accepted the attorney referral. She gave me what I needed, and she covered herself at the same time. So she cooperated with the cleanup and protected her position." "Yes, and you can't do anything about it." "No," Dominic said. "I can't." He looked out the window. "She played it better than I did. From the beginning, she played it better than I did." The car moved into traffic. Nico said, "She's not the only one." Dominic was quiet. "Amara played it better than you did too," Nico said, not unkindly. 7 days. She sat in that house for 7 days, and she built her exit, and she left without taking anything that wasn't hers, and she filed the papers before you even knew she was gone. A pause. Two most important women in the last 2 years of your life both outmaneuvered you. Car hit a red light. "I know," Dominic said. "What does that tell you?" "That I've been looking at the wrong things for a long time." He put his head back against the seat. "That I've been measuring everything by the wrong instruments." Nico didn't say anything to that. "The papers came," Dominic said. "From her attorneys. Yesterday morning." Another pause. "I know. Marco told me. She's not asking for anything of mine. The filing, it's clean. It's precise. She's protecting her own assets and releasing any claim on mine, and that's it. That's the whole document." He paused. "Her attorney is good. What are you going to do?" Dominic looked at the city through the window. "I don't know yet," he said. That was a lie. He did know. He had known since sitting in the restaurant watching Caruso walk away and understanding the complete picture of the last 2 months. He had known since the morning he came home to find the ring on the desk. He had probably known on some level since the night of the wedding, when he had looked at his phone in the middle of the reception and thought only about managing the two things simultaneously, and had not once, not for a single moment, considered what it would mean to the woman he had just married if she knew. He knew what he was going to do. He just needed a few more days to be certain it was the right decision and not the sentimental one, because he had spent a lifetime distrusting the sentimental decision, and he needed to be sure the two things weren't the same thing this time. He went back to the estate. He went to his study, and he sat at the desk, and he put the wedding ring on the desk in front of him, and he looked at it for a long time. And then he opened his laptop and looked at the dissolution documents from Veld. And then he looked at the preliminary summary from his audit team about the scope of the internal repairs needed to the internal repairs, the legitimate business structure. And then he looked at the legal filing from Amara's attorney. And he held all of these things in his mind simultaneously and tried to understand what the story was, not the individual events, but the actual story, the thing that connected them. He had built something enormous, and he had built it with a blind spot at the center. Not ignorance. He was not ignorant. He had known his own capacity for compartmentalization. He had known that he kept different parts of his life sealed from each other. He had told himself this was discipline, He had told himself this was how you survived in a world where information was the most dangerous currency. What he had not told himself, what he had never examined directly, because examining it would have required a kind of honesty he had not been interested in, was that the compartmentalization was also how he avoided accountability to anyone for the whole of what he was. Nico knew parts. Valeria knew parts. His captains knew parts. His attorneys knew parts. The city officials who attended his events knew parts. Amara had been, he understood now, the first person he had considered letting see the whole. And then he hadn't. He had made her a part instead. He had assigned her a role and put her in a compartment and moved on. He sat at the desk for 3 hours. At 11 that night his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. Chicago area code. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Mr. Ravello, a woman's voice. Professional, measured. My name is Diane Yates. I'm a federal investigator with the Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling because we've been conducting a review of certain business entities, and your name has come up in the context of a related party inquiry. A pause. I'd like to schedule a voluntary conversation this week, if possible. The study was completely silent. Dominic said, "You'll want to contact my attorney." "Of course," she said. "I have that information. I wanted to make personal contact first, as a professional courtesy." "I appreciate the courtesy," he said. "Have a good evening, Mr. Ravello." She hung up. Dominic put the phone on the desk next to the wedding ring and looked at both of them and understood that the Veld situation had not been contained as cleanly as he had believed, or that Caruso's movements had been observed by someone with an interest in financial structures connected to real estate, or that the Dantini referral fee trail had been pulled by someone with better forensic tools than his own accountant, or some combination of all three. Whatever the source, the federal inquiry existed. And it existed because Valeria had built the Veld arrangement inside his structure, and Caruso had existed on the other end of it, and Dantini had facilitated real estate transactions with traceable fee structures. And somewhere in that chain, a thread had been visible to someone who was paid to look for visible threads. He did not panic. He had been in difficult situations before. He had resources, legal and otherwise. He had attorneys who were very good at very specific things. He had the documentation of the separation from Veld and the dated records of Valeria's unauthorized activity, and the cooperation of his compliance team, and the clean paper trail of his own role, which was he had been careful about this, his entire adult life, genuinely clean at the level that federal investigators examined. But it was not nothing. It was the moment when every consequence of every decision arrived simultaneously, which was how consequences tended to arrive when you had spent long enough avoiding them. He picked up the phone and called his attorney. While it rang, he looked at the wedding ring on the desk. He thought about Amara on scaffolding somewhere, her hands on old materials, pulling something back from what it had become toward what it had originally been. He thought about the fact that she had known for 7 days, and had said nothing, and had planned everything, and had left nothing behind that was his. He thought about what that level of dignity cost a person. What it required to sustain it, to maintain it through 7 mornings of eggs and 7 evenings of candlelit dinners, to smile at the right moments and say the right things, and carry that weight without letting it show. Not because she was performing for him, but because she was protecting herself from the additional injury of being to be injured by him. He thought about a word she had used once, early in their relationship, when she was describing what it felt like to work on a building that had been neglected for a long time. The hardest part, she had said, isn't the damage itself. The hardest part is that the building doesn't know it's damaged. It's just standing there, doing what it was built to do, holding up what it was built to hold, not knowing that the thing supporting it has already failed. She had been talking about buildings. His attorney answered. Dominic said, "We have a federal inquiry. I need you here tonight." He stood from the desk. "And I need you to tell me honestly what is the worst realistic outcome, and what is the best realistic outcome, and what specifically separates those two things." His attorney said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes. "Bring the Veld documentation," Dominic said. "All of it." He hung up. He looked at the desk one more time, the ring, the phone, the legal papers, the audit report. Then he made the decision he had been toward for 3 days. He picked up the Veld documentation and the audit summary, and he moved them to the side table, organized and ready for the attorney. He picked up Amara's legal filing. He opened it to the final page where his signature was required. He picked up a pen. His attorney arrived in 38 minutes, knocked on the study door, came in, and stopped when he saw what Dominic was holding. "Dominic, I'm going to sign this," Dominic said. He said it plainly, without the particular leveled tone he used when he was making a point. He said the way you state a fact about yourself that you have finished examining. "Before we talk about anything else, I'm signing this tonight." His attorney looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "She's not asking for anything of mine," Dominic said. "She's not a liability. She's not connected to any of this." He looked at the page. "She deserves to have this finished." He signed. He put the cap back on the pen. He slid the papers to the side of the desk. "Now," he said, and his voice had shifted back to the controlled, operational register of a man managing a crisis. "Tell me what we're doing about the federal inquiry." His attorney sat down. Outside the estate, the city ran on the way it always ran, the traffic and the lights and the lakes, somewhere in the darkness beyond everything, cold and steady and entirely indifferent to what happened in any single lit window of the skyline. Dominic Ravello, the man who had built something enormous on the assumption that control was the same thing as power, sat across from his attorney in a study that still smelled faintly of a woman who was already 500 miles away, and began the process of accounting for everything he had done and everything he had failed as different from to do. And the two lists were not as different from each other as he had spent his whole life believing them to be. The attorney's name was Gerald Fitch, and he had been doing this work for 31 years, which meant he had sat across from a great many men in the middle of the night, in rooms that smelled like old money and recent trouble, and he had learned to read those rooms the way other people read faces. This room told him something he had not expected. Dominic Ravello was not afraid. Not of the federal inquiry, not of Caruso, not of Valeria or the Veld documentation or the Dantini trail or any of the specific innumerable problems that Gerald had been mentally organizing since the phone call 40 minutes ago. Something to die quietly. There was something underneath all of that, something Gerald couldn't immediately name, that was driving the mood of the room more than any of the legal facts. He set his briefcase on the side chair and opened it, and took out his yellow legal pad and his pen and sat down. "Walk me through the inquiry contact," he said. Dominic walked him through it. The name, the phrasing, the courtesy framing. Gerald wrote and listened and asked 3 specific questions, and then sat back and looked at what he had written. "Related party inquiry," he said, "not a direct target designation." "That's important. I know the difference." "Then you know this is still manageable." Gerald set the pad on his knee. "The Veld separation documentation, if it's clean and dated, which you're telling me is that's your primary protection. Question is Caruso and what he's saying to whoever's listening." "Caruso wants money," Dominic said. "He'll stop talking if the money situation is resolved." "Through Valeria's counsel." "Through Valeria's counsel." Gerald made a note, and Valeria herself. "Her cooperation is essential. If she decides to characterize your knowledge of the arrangement differently, but..." "She won't," Dominic said. Gerald looked up. "You're confident?" "She protected herself by cooperating with me. The cooperation is documented. If she changes her characterization now, she damages her own position." He paused. "Valeria is not self-destructive. It's one of the things I always..." He stopped, looked at the window. "She'll hold her position." Gerald studied him for a moment, then looked back at his pad. "All right, here's what happens next. Monday morning, I contact the inquiry office and schedule the voluntary conversation. We go in fully prepared, every document, every timeline, every piece of the separation clearly laid out. We do not wait for them to build a picture. We give them the picture. Transparency. Controlled transparency," Gerald said. "There's a difference. You're not confessing to anything, because there's nothing to confess that isn't already documented in your favor." You're a principal whose employee exceeded her authority. That story is consistent with every document, every communication, every piece of evidence that exists. He paused. Is that story true? Dominic looked at him directly. Yes. Gerald held the look for a moment. Okay, he said. They worked until 2 in the morning. Gerald made calls too that night, to colleagues who specialized in the specific intersection of financial crimes review and legitimate business structure defense. Dominic answered every question without hesitation and without embellishment, which Gerald noted internally as the behavior of either a very innocent man or a very experienced one. And in his 31 years, he had learned that those two categories sometimes overlapped in ways that didn't matter for the immediate legal situation. When Gerald finally left, Dominic walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment in the cold front entrance. One more thing, Gerald said, and his voice had shifted slightly out of attorney mode into something older and less billable. The dissolution papers, the ones you signed tonight. Dominic said nothing. That was the right call, Gerald said. Legally and otherwise, he picked up his briefcase. Have a good night. He went to his car. Dominic stood in the doorway and watched the taillights disappear through the gates, and then stood there a moment longer in the cold, his hands in his jacket pockets. The left hand closing around the wedding ring that was still there from this afternoon. He had forgotten it was there, or he had chosen not to put it down yet. He wasn't certain which. He went inside. He did not go back to the study. He went upstairs to the room that was something supposed to be theirs, the suite with the window that looked east, that had dying flowers someone had finally cleared away and replaced with nothing. Just a clean, empty table where the vase had been. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and he sat there for a long time without moving, and outside Chicago ran through its late-night cycle the last trains, the early trucks, the particular sound a city makes at 3 in the morning, when it is between its night and its day self, and is briefly, temporarily, neither. Put the ring on the nightstand. He lay down on top of the covers with his jacket still on. He did not sleep for a long time. When he did sleep, he dreamed about nothing he could remember when he woke. Monday arrived, the way Mondays arrived, after difficult weekends with a flat gray light and an agenda that expected you to be functional regardless of whether you felt it. Dominic was functional. He met with Gerald and 2 additional attorneys at 9. He reviewed the complete documentation package, 57 pages of financial records, organizational charts, dated communications, compliance team findings, and the formalized separation agreement from Valeria's independent counsel, which had arrived by courier at 7:30 that morning, and which Gerald read with the focused attention of a man looking for problems and finding fewer than he had expected. Her attorney is good, Gerald said. I know, Dominic said. She's positioned herself as a party who established unauthorized arrangements under a misunderstanding of her authority, who cooperated fully with the parent organization's corrective process, and who has no ongoing relationship with external parties. He set the document down. That's a clean exit. Yes, Dominic said. You paid for it. Yes. Gerald looked at him over his glasses. That's either very generous or very calculated. Both, Dominic said. Mostly calculated. It doesn't matter. The voluntary conversation with the federal inquiry was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. Gerald's contact at the inquiry office, who was a former colleague from a previous professional life, and who communicated with the precision of someone who wanted it known that the conversation was happening through official channels and not through any improper relationship, confirmed the appointment and the format, which was an informal information session, rather than a formal examination, which was exactly the distinction that mattered. Related party inquiry, Gerald said again, after he hung up. They're looking at Caruso. You're on the edges of the picture, not the center. Because of the separation documentation, and because your own financial records are consistent and clean, and have been consistently clean for longer than this inquiry has existed. Gerald paused. Whatever else you've been involved in over the years, Dominic, you kept the legitimate businesses actually legitimate. That's what's protecting you right now. Dominic thought about the hairline crack, the thing that looked stable until the second it wasn't. I so, he said. The week moved forward with the specific momentum of a process that had been set in motion and would now proceed to its conclusion regardless of how anyone felt about it. The Veld entities were dissolved. The Dontini relationship was terminated with documentation, provided to the inquiry office proactively. On Gerald's recommendation, a move that cost Dominic a supplier relationship and gained him the distinct advantage of being the party who disclosed rather than the party who was caught. Ferretti, the mid-level operations director, was terminated formally and referred to an employment attorney. The financial irregularities in his unit were documented, quantified at a level that was meaningful but not catastrophic, and added to the comprehensive internal review that Dominic's compliance team was now conducting across every unit of Ravello Capital Partners. The review found 2 more small irregularities in units that Ferretti had interacted with. Both were addressed. Both were documented. On Tuesday, Nico came to the estate for dinner. Not a meeting dinner, the way they had occasionally shared a meal over the years when the professional and the personal ran close enough together that separating them was more work than it was worth. They sat at the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, which was Dominic's choice, and the cook made something simple, and they ate and talked about the inquiry and the cleanup and the specific details that still required attention. And then, when those things were covered, they sat with their food, and the conversation went quiet in the way that conversations between people who have known each other a very long time can go quiet without being uncomfortable. After a while, Nico said, "How are you?" Not about the inquiry. Not about any of it. Dominic set his fork down. "I don't know." That's an honest answer. "I've been trying to be honest," Dominic said. "It's slower than the other way. More inconvenient." Nico almost smiled. "Generally is." "I signed the papers," Dominic said. "I know. I'm not going to contest anything. I'm not going to make it complicated." He looked at the table. "She deserves to have it finished cleanly." Nico was quiet for a moment. "You love her." Dominic picked up his fork again. "That's not a useful piece of information at this point." "No," Nico said. "But it's true." "A lot of things are true," Dominic said. "The question is what you do with them." Nico looked at him. "What are you going to do with it?" Dominic didn't answer for a moment. He ate. He looked at the window and at the dark yard beyond it and at the estate that he had built and filled with everything that communicated power and had somehow never thought to fill with anything that communicated the simpler things. The things that didn't require an audience to mean something. "Nothing," he said. "I'm going to do nothing with it." She made her choice, and it was the right choice. He paused. "I'm going to focus on fixing what I broke in the places I can still reach. Business, the structure, the people who work in it. And yourself," Nico said. Dominic looked at him. "The places you can still reach," Nico said. "That includes yourself." Dominic says nothing for a moment. "Then I'm working on it." Wednesday's meeting with the federal inquiry lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was conducted in a conference room in a federal building on South Dearborn, a room designed to be unremarkable, neutral-colored walls, and a table that was neither impressive nor shabby, the kind of space that was supposed to say, "This is just a conversation," which was, of course, exactly what made it not just a conversation. Agent Diane Yates was 40-something, with a quality of focused attention that Dominic recognized as professional, not hostile, not performing authority, just genuinely interested in information. She had a colleague who said very little and took notes. Gerald sat beside Dominic. She asked good questions. Not trap questions, specific questions. Sequenced questions, the kind that were trying to understand structure rather than catch a person in a contradiction. She asked about the Veld arrangement's inception. She asked about Valeria's role and authority and the documentation of her responsibilities. She asked about the timing of the internal audit and who had initiated it. "I initiated it," Dominic said, "when I became aware of the arrangement's existence." "And when was that?" "When I reviewed documentation that came to me through the compliance process," he said, which was technically accurate in every particular, and which Gerald had carefully reviewed with him beforehand. She asked about Caruso. "I'm not familiar with Mr. Caruso beyond what I've learned in the context of this situation," Dominic said. He's not a party I've done business with, but parties connected to your organization have, through an unauthorized arrangement, yes, which is documented. She made a note. She asked about the Dontini referral fee structure. Gerald interjected to note that the documentation regarding the Dontini relationship had been proactively disclosed to the inquiry office the previous week, which Agent Yates acknowledged with the slight nod of someone who had already read it. At the end of the 2 hours and 40 minutes, she set her pen down and looked at Dominic directly. "Mr. Ravello," she said, "I want to ask you something outside the specific parameters of this inquiry." Gerald tensed slightly beside him. "Go ahead," Dominic said. "In your assessment, was the Veld arrangement established with the intent to obscure the origin or destination of funds?" Gerald said, "I'd advise—" "No," Dominic said. Agent Yates looked at him. "In my assessment," he said, "the arrangement was established to enrich the individual who created it while using the infrastructure of my organization as cover. The intent was personal financial gain, not fund obscuration. The obscuration was a byproduct of the method, not the purpose." He paused. "That's my assessment. The documentation supports it." A moment of quiet. "Thank you," she said. She said it with a quality that was not quite warmth, but was not entirely professional distance either. It was the quality of someone acknowledging a specific kind of answer. They left the federal building at 4:17 in the afternoon. Gerald walked beside Dominic for half of a block before he said anything. "That last answer," he said, "was accurate," Dominic said. "It was also very well framed." "I know. The documentation does support it." "I know, Gerald." Gerald stopped walking. Dominic stopped a step later and looked back at him. "It went well," Gerald said. "Better than I expected. The related party designation is almost certainly going to hold. You're going to be a witness background, not a target. Proactive disclosures helped considerably." "Good." "But Dominic—" Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man who had 31 years of context for what he was about to say. "This situation, the whole of it, the Veld thing, the internal irregularities, what happened with your wife, this is what happens when the structure gets too complicated. When there are too many compartments and not enough people who can see the whole." Dominic looked at him. "I'm not telling you how to run your life," Gerald said. "I'm telling you what the case file looks like from the outside." "It looks like a man who didn't pay enough attention," Dominic said. "It looks like a man who paid a great deal of attention to the wrong things," Gerald said. "Which is different and harder to fix." He went to get his car. Dominic stood on the sidewalk in the cold and looked up at the federal building's unremarkable facade, and then looked down at the street, and then started walking because he needed to walk, because the car was a block away, and he needed the space between here and there to be something he moved through on his own terms. The months that followed were not a story he told anyone. They were not dramatic in the way that the preceding weeks had been dramatic. There were no confrontations, no revelations, no moments where something enormous cracked open and changed everything in an instant. What there was instead was the slow, unglamorous work of a man deciding, day by day, what kind of person he was going to be with the time and resources he had left. The federal inquiry closed in the fourth month after the voluntary meeting. Caruso was charged with financial crimes related to the Veld arrangement and 3 other schemes that had nothing to do with Dominic Ravello. Valeria's cooperation with the inquiry provided through her independent counsel in the careful and precise terms her attorney had constructed placed her in the category of cooperating witness rather than charged party. She received a civil penalty and a 5-year bar from certain classes of financial service roles. Dominic read the inquiry closure notification in his study on a Tuesday morning, and then set it on the desk and looked out the window for a while, and then went to his morning meeting with the Ravello Capital Partners Board. The board meeting was the 3rd restructuring session in 4 months. 2 of the 7 board members, the independently wealthy ones, the ones he couldn't simply instruct, had used the Veld situation as an occasion to push for governance reforms they had wanted for years. An independent audit committee, a formalized compliance reporting structure that answered to the board rather than to management. Conflict of interest policy with actual teeth. Dominic had agreed to all of it, not because he was forced to, Because, in the careful, slow-moving examination he had been conducting of himself since the night he came home to find the ring on the desk, he had arrived at the understanding that the governance reforms were correct. That the structures that had allowed Valeria to operate as she had operated were structures he had built, maintained, and benefited from precisely because they gave him unchecked discretion. That unchecked discretion and personal integrity were not the same thing, and he had confused them for too long. The two board members who had pushed for the reforms looked at him across the table when he signed the governance resolution. One of them, a woman named Patricia Huang, who had been on the board for 9 years and who had never once softened her assessments to make him more comfortable, said, "It's a stronger company for this." "Yes," Dominic said. "It is." She looked at him for a moment. "You're different," she said. Not critically, just observationally, the way an intelligent person names what they're seeing. "I'm working on it," he said, which was the same thing he had said to Nico, and which was the truest sentence he had available. Nico himself was promoted. That was the word they used, though in the context of the Ravello organization, it meant something more specific than the ordinary usage. Nico was given formal authority over the restructuring of the legitimate business operations, an authority he had exercised informally for years, and that Dominic had never made explicit because making it explicit would have required acknowledging how much he depended on it. He made it explicit now. He signed the documentations himself and handed it to Nico in the kitchen at the estate, the same kitchen where they'd had dinner the week of the inquiry. Nico looked at the documents for a long moment. "You know what this means," he said. "It means what it says," Dominic said. "It means you trust me with all of it." "I've always trusted you with all of it," Dominic said. "I just never wrote it down." He paused. That was arrogance. Keeping it informal kept the power gradient where I wanted it. Nico looked up. "I'm saying that out loud," Dominic said, "because you deserve to hear me say it." Nico folded the documents carefully and put them in his jacket pocket. "Celeste is going to want to celebrate," he said. "She'll want to make dinner." "Tell her I'd like that," Dominic said. He meant it. Somewhere in the 6th month, he stopped keeping Amara's wedding photograph on his desk. Not because the looking at it had stopped meaning something. Because it had started meaning the wrong thing, it had started being a kind of holding on, a daily ritual of proximity to something he didn't have the right to be proximate to anymore. And he recognized that ritual for what it was, and understood it was not helping him move in the direction he needed to move. He put the photograph in a box, not thrown away, not destroyed. Put in a box in a closet with other things that were real and finished and required respectful storage rather than daily examination. He sat in the study that evening, without the photograph on the desk, and the desk looked different. Empty, in a way that was accurate. He left it empty. In the 7th month, he received the final dissolution papers from Amara's attorney. The marriage was formally, legally ended. Every document in order. Every asset correctly categorized hers, his, and the very small category of jointly held things from the 9 days they had been legally married, which Amara's attorney had handled with a precision that was either legally mandated or was itself a statement about how Amara approached the ending of things. Dominic sat with the papers for a while. Then he signed them. He had already signed the initial response. This was the final confirmation, the official closing, the document that said, "This is done." He wrote his name clearly and put the cap on the pen and put the papers in a separate pile for Gerald's office. And then he reached into his jacket pocket, an old habit. He kept reaching into that pocket and found nothing there, because the ring had been on the nightstand for months now, and he had moved it eventually to a small box on the dresser, and the dresser was the place it was going to stay. He looked at the signed papers. He thought about a woman sitting alone in a bridal, sweet with dying flowers, and that had told her everything. He thought about the specific courage it had taken to come to breakfast the next morning. He thought about 7 days of that courage, sustained and invisible, burning underneath a surface that showed him nothing he wasn't supposed to see. He thought, "I will never understand completely what that cost her, and I don't get to ask." He put the papers in the pile for Gerald. He went to make himself coffee, He stood in the kitchen and watched the coffee brew, and thought about what Patricia Huang had said, "You're different," and turned the word over in his mind, and decided it was not quite the right word. Different implied that the previous version had been replaced, which was not what had happened. The previous version was still entirely present. The arrogance, the compartmentalization, the capacity for the specific kind of self-deception that lets a man believe he is making strategic decisions when he is making selfish ones, all of that was still in the architecture. It had not been demolished. It had been examined and exposed to light and brought into a structural relationship with other things that were also true: the capacity for accountability, the willingness to be slower and less certain and less in control, the understanding that power and worth were not synonymous, not different, amended, partially repaired, with the damage still visible, the way honest restoration work always left the evidence of what had happened, rather than pretending the damage had never existed. He poured his coffee. He took it to the window and looked at the yard in the gray morning light. He was 51 years old, and he had built something enormous, and he had nearly destroyed it through a combination of arrogance and inattention and the specific failure of imagination that comes from spending so long at the top of a hierarchy that you forget other people in the hierarchy have their own interior lives running parallel to yours. He had nearly destroyed it, and then he had repaired most of the damage, slowly and expensively, and without the satisfaction of a clean resolution, because clean resolutions were for simpler problems. He was going to be all right, not happy, exactly, not in the uncomplicated way the word implied, but functional and honest and clear-eyed in a way he had not been before, and those things had a value that the previous version of himself would not have recognized as value at all. He drank his coffee. He thought about one more thing. He went to his desk later that morning and opened the bottom drawer, the personal one, not the professional one, and found the sketchbook. He had found it 2 months after she left, in the storage room off the study, in a box of materials from the architectural preservation project she had been consulting on before the wedding. She had apparently left a work bag behind in the rush of her packing, or perhaps she had genuinely not known it was there, because it was in a storage space she had only used twice, and someone on the estate staff had consolidated it into a box, and the box had sat in the storage room until Dominic had gone through that room as part of the broader process of understanding what remained. He had held it for a long time when he found it. It was her working sketchbook, not the professional presentations she made to clients, but the actual Frankie document, the one where she drew and redrew and made notes to herself in the margins and crossed things out and started over. He recognized her handwriting from the 3 words she had left him on the card. He recognized the quality of attention in the drawings from the way she had once described her work to him, patient and specific, not trying to make things beautiful, just trying to understand them accurately. He could have sent it to her attorney's office. That was the correct procedure. Anything belonging to her went through the legal channel, clean and documented. He did not send it through the attorney. He sat with it for 2 months, which was too long, which he knew was too long, but which he could not quite bring himself to shorten. And then one morning in the 8th month after she had left, he sat at his desk and took out a card, plain white, drugstore quality, which was a choice he was conscious of, and he wrote a single sentence in his own handwriting, which was not as clean as hers, which was the handwriting of a man who had always moved too fast to be careful about letters. This was always yours. I finally understand that you were too. He looked at it. It was true. Both sentences were completely and straightforwardly true, which was a different experience than most of the sentences he had composed in the last 2 years, and the difference had a physical quality, a slight loosening somewhere in his chest, like a load-bearing element that had been under sustained compression, finally being allowed to rest. He packed the sketchbook in a plain padded envelope with the card. No return address. He had her address from the legal correspondence. She had relocated to Charleston, South Carolina, a detail that her attorney's letterhead had made clear, and which Dominic had noted and not acted on for 8 months, which was itself a form of respect for a boundary she had not had to state explicitly. He sealed the envelope, He addressed it in his own handwriting. He walked it to the front entrance and gave it to the car service himself, which was unusual. He generally didn't personally carry packages, but which felt, in this particular case, like the right level of involvement. Not delegated. Personal. The last personal gesture available to him in this direction. He watched the car go through the gates. He went back inside. He went to his study and sat at the desk and looked at the empty surface where the photograph had been and where the sketchbook had been sitting for 2 months, and the empty surface was just an empty surface. And after a moment, he pulled the quarterly compliance report toward him and began to read it, because the work was there. And the work was real, and the work was the correct place to put his attention. In Charleston, South Carolina, the building was an 1,887 commercial structure on a street of similar buildings, most of which had been converted to other uses decades ago and neglected in the way that useful things get neglected when they stop being visibly useful. Amara's firm had been brought in by a preservation trust that had acquired the building 8 months earlier, and the scope of work was exactly the kind of scope she preferred: comprehensive, demanding, the kind of job that required her to understand the building completely before she touched it. She was on the scaffolding on the 3rd floor when the package arrived, which meant she didn't see it until late afternoon when she came down and found it on the work site table with the rest of the day's deliveries. She saw the handwriting immediately. She picked up the envelope and held it for a moment without opening it. Around her, her 2-person crew was packing up for the day, their conversations overlapping in the ordinary end-of-workday way, the specific sound of people putting down the day's work and picking up the evening. The building smelled like old wood and plaster dust and the particular dry smell of disturbed historical material. She set the envelope on the table and went to help with the equipment packed down. She did not open it until she was alone, until the crew had gone and the building was quiet and the late afternoon light was coming through the tall windows at the angle that made the original plaster work visible. In a way it was at other times of day the texture and the craft of hands from 1,887, made briefly legible by the specific quality of late light. She sat on an overturned equipment case and opened the envelope. The sketchbook came out in her hands. She had thought it was lost. She had looked for it twice in the weeks she arrived in Charleston, and had eventually concluded it had been in the work bag she had left behind at the estate, which meant it was gone, which she had grieved in a small and practical way, not the grief of great loss, but the particular frustration of losing a working document that could not be replaced, only reconstructed. It was not damaged. It was exactly as she had left it. She turned it over in her hands, opened it to a random page, a detailed study of a cornice profile, with margin notes about the mortar composition, her handwriting in the particular compressed style she used when she was thinking and writing simultaneously. She closed it. She looked at the card. She read it once. She read it again. She sat with it. Outside, Charleston was doing what Charleston did. At that hour, the light changing on the water somewhere beyond the buildings, the city settling into its evening with a quality of ease that the Midwest cities she had lived in didn't quite have. A different relationship to time, to pace, to the idea that the day was long enough to contain more than efficiency. She thought about Dominic in his study. She did not know that was where he was. She was constructing, from the handwriting on the card, an image of where and how he had written it. And the image was probably not accurate in all its particulars, but was accurate enough in its essential truth. A man at a desk, writing 2 sentences that were true, sending them without any expectation of what came after. She thought about the wedding night, not with the full, acute pain of the original experience that pain had done its work and moved through her over the 8 months since, the way pain does when you don't try to hold it still or examine it to death, but simply let it be what it is, and give it the space and time it requires. What remained was not pain exactly, but its residue, the knowledge of what the experience had been, available for reference, no longer active. She thought about the 7 days. She thought about the eggs at the morning table, and Dominic looking at her with that unguarded expression, genuinely moved, genuinely wanting what he was looking at. And she thought about how that expression and the message on his tablet could exist in the same man simultaneously, and she did not think about this with bitterness. She thought about it with the particular clarity that comes after enough time and distance to see something's actual shape. He had been a man who had not been honest enough with himself to understand what he wanted until after he had destroyed his access to it. A specific kind of tragedy. It was not her tragedy. She had had her own damage to manage, and had managed it. But it was a real thing that had happened to a real person, and she could see it now without it requiring her to feel responsible for it. She placed the card inside the front cover of the sketchbook. She held the sketchbook against her chest for a moment. Then she stood, tucked it under her arm, picked up her bag, and walked to the building's main entrance, pausing at the threshold, the way she always paused, at the threshold of a building she was working on an old habit, almost a ritual, looking back at the interior and taking in the whole of it. The high ceilings, the damaged and repairable plaster. The bones of the thing, 1,887, solid and salvageable and worth the work. She looked at it. Then she turned and walked out into the warm evening. The street was golden at that hour, the light doing what late afternoon light did in coastal places, making everything slightly more itself. She walked toward her car, and she did not feel the need to look over her shoulder at anything, and that lack of need, that clean, uncomplicated orientation toward what was in front of her, was something she had earned in a way she had not understood she was earning it while it was happening. She drove home. Her apartment was on the third floor of a building that predated the Civil War, which she had chosen partly because of the architecture and partly because the landlord, a 70-year-old woman named Mrs. Tran, who had restored the building herself over 20 years of weekends, was the kind of person Amara wanted as a neighbor. The apartment was 2 rooms and a kitchen and a bathroom and a set of windows that faced south and caught good light all day. She put the sketchbook on her work table, which was covered in reference photographs and material samples and notes for the 1,887 project. She made dinner, something simple, the kind of cooking she had done for herself for most of her adult life, before the estate and its kitchen and its staff and its enormous abundance of everything. Eggs and toast and strong coffee, which was what she had been eating lately in the evenings, because she liked it, and because there was nobody whose preference she had to consider alongside her own. She ate at the small table by the south windows. She looked at the sketchbook on the work table. She looked at the city outside the windows. She thought about the sentence, "I finally understand that you were too," and she thought about what it cost a man like Dominic to write a sentence like that. What internal reorganization had to happen before it became possible to say something that clear and that final, without a request attached and without an expectation of response. She thought good. She meant it simply, not sarcastically, not with residual bitterness or with the complicated warmth of someone who still wanted the thing. Just good. He had arrived at understanding something real. That was good. It was better than the alternative. The world was better when people understood things than when they didn't. She washed her plate and her cup. She sat down at the work table and opened the sketchbook and began reviewing the cornice study from page 9, which she needed for the contractor meeting on Thursday, and the evening went quiet around her. The city's outside the windows moving through its ordinary rhythms, and she worked for 2 hours with the particular absorbed focus that she had had since childhood, the ability to be entirely inside the work, present to it, not thinking about anything outside it. When she finished, she closed the sketchbook. She looked at the card, still visible inside the front cover. She closed the cover over it. She got up and turned off the work table lamp and went to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at Charleston at night, not Chicago's scale, not its particular quality of ambition and weight, but a different kind of city, older in certain ways and lighter in certain ways, and operating on a different understanding of what a city was for. She was going to be fine. She was, in fact, already fine, not in the provisional, future tense way she had understood it, on the train from Chicago 8 months ago, but in the present, actual, daily sense of being a person whose life was her own, and whose work was real, and whose apartment was small, and whose eggs at dinner were exactly what she wanted. She had not lost anything she couldn't live without. She had lost things that had looked, for a while, like things she couldn't live without. That was a different fact. She went to bed. She slept well. In the morning, she was back on the scaffolding by 7:30, her hands in the plaster of 1,887. The building giving up its history to her patient and specific attention, the way damaged things gave up their histories to people who were willing to take the time to understand them rather than simply impose a new surface over the old damage and call it repaired. You could tell the difference, always. In the restored building's high ceilings, in the careful work of honest hands, in the plaster that had been brought back to itself rather than replaced with something easier. You could always tell the difference between repair and concealment. The work of someone understood what they were saving, between the work who understood what they were saving and the work of someone who just wanted it to look different from the outside. Amara Bennett understood the difference. She had always understood the difference. That understanding was the thing he had not been able to buy, or use, or control, or hold on to after she walked out the door. It was also the thing that would carry her, unconstrained, for the rest of her life.